Series event. I'm Ferris Taylor, Executive Director of the Healthcare Executive Group, and today's session is one in our ongoing series of HCG webinars. I'm joined today by John Zuziak, and this is a fireside chat. We appreciate John picking up the backdrop for the fireside. We appreciate that. And we also want to thank our longtime HCG sponsor, Change Healthcare, for sponsoring this event. Our topic is navigating information security in the new world. And by the new world, we're really referring to COVID-19 pandemic. And it's an interactive discussion today. It couldn't be more timely or relevant given what's happening to cybersecurity in healthcare. We'll talk more about that. Cybersecurity is challenging almost every aspect of all industries, but especially healthcare. This session is interactive, so we hope you'll submit your questions and observations around privacy and security as we go along. Before starting, there's a couple of housekeeping notes. As all attendees are on mute, we encourage you to interactively submit your questions and comments at any time via the question box in the dashboard on the right of your screen, or at least on the right of my screen. We will weave your questions into our discussion. And finally, if we're unable to get to any of your questions during the webinar, we will provide a summary of this session, but also in a recap document, all of the questions that we might not get to. Briefly, the Healthcare Executive Group is a national association of a network of executives and thought leaders. We're celebrating our 32nd year working together to improve and reshape healthcare. Our overall mission is guiding healthcare executives through innovation, change, and growth. And all of that is happening today. We interact interactively and interact regularly over multiple channels, including this webinar series that takes place monthly, our national industry pulse research and reports, white papers, digital and social media, newsletters, and other activities. By facilitating these frequent interactions, which right at the moment all are virtual, we aim to provide a platform for networking, information sharing, and thought leadership. You can learn more about how we convene, promote networking opportunities, and facilitate healthcare executives by going to hcg.org. Throughout the year, culminating at the end of the year, our members discuss and debate critical issues, challenges, and opportunities in healthcare. And John, if you can give us the HCG Top 10 list. We formally vote and rank an HCG Top 10 list of priorities each year for the coming year. As you'll see when we get the slide up, specifically, today's session will focus on priority number 10 that was voted on late last year, which is privacy and security. But this topic also touches on several other critical issues and challenges, including interoperability, especially consumer access to data, and accessible points of care, which includes telehealth, and we'll talk more about each of those today. These topics are on everyone's mind, especially with the new challenges of COVID-19. The Change Healthcare Consulting Team and their experience over many years in working with a variety of healthcare stakeholders have become industry experts and pioneers in the ever-changing cybersecurity space. To kick off today's fireside chat, let me introduce my friend and colleague, John Zuziak. John's the practice leader of IT risk management at Change Healthcare Consulting. And to start out, John, why don't you tell us how you got to this point in cybersecurity and a bit about Change Healthcare?
Absolutely. Thank you, Ferris. So, I came into cybersecurity more from the IT side. I was part of a network administrator on a team that was providing IT services for the financial industry, credit unions, and banks. From there, I really started to get into security, realized there was a passion for it. And so my first real role within security was within a healthcare organization, and realized that was the culmination of a lot of great things. I have a passion for security, so getting to provide security services, risk management for organizations is great, but also having the ability to work within the healthcare space where you truly are impacting people's lives daily is phenomenal. I started off with Catholic Health Initiatives as their regional information security officer for the Kentucky market at a time when the Affordable Care Act was just coming into play and we were acquiring facilities left and right. So I had a lot of merger and acquisitions that we were working on. And then I went into more of a national role as a director of risk management and realized how much I appreciate and like the risk management side of security, where you can start to take some of those technical aspects, blend them with the business and business needs in their direction, and really start to make things happen. And it's just a really interesting approach. So appreciate that time there. And then went to as a security officer for an organization and built their program. So a lot of different things within healthcare and within the security space.
Terrific. And with that background and with your experience across the industry and now on the front line supporting the Change Healthcare clients, is cybersecurity important? What are the threats? Are they increasing? What's going on with cybersecurity?
Ooh. Yeah, so cybersecurity is definitely, I will say it's important, absolutely, especially in that healthcare space. We have seen a dramatic increase of attacks recently with COVID. I will say the attackers are very opportunistic, and so COVID, the coronavirus, kind of this whole pandemic, has created a fantastic way for the attackers to get our attention. So what we're seeing is the phishing attacks have increased dramatically. And more than doubled in some areas, some regions. It's over 600% increase from previous levels. So they're using that. They're preying on our weaknesses, where we're wanting to get information on what's the latest of the virus itself, the stay-at-home orders. Just all this information that we're trying to gather. That's what the attackers are using to get into our networks and our data. Another point on that is recently. Within this time period, we've seen that the Department of Health and Human Services has actually listed just over 105 breaches affecting more than 2.5 million individuals. So, you can see we're seeing a dramatic increase in the number of attacks, and it's also playing well into the amount of breaches that occur.
In preparation for this discussion, and I thought those are some staggering statistics, especially where healthcare, we really can't put the data back into an account when it's breached. Banks can put money back into the bank account when it's lost, but there's something different about healthcare, and we'll talk about that. But I was reading about the 3 pillars of effective cybersecurity practice: that confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So to start us off, can you break out some things for non-technical leaders, directors, managers in healthcare plans that they should know about each of the 3 pillars, and then we'll elaborate on those.
Absolutely. So I do have a slide for this I'm going to bring up because I think this helps, having that visual does help. So you mentioned that the triad when it comes to cybersecurity. We do focus on the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the data. One thing to keep in mind, the confidentiality is all about protecting the information from unauthorized parties, right? That's the bread and butter of the HIPAA security rule. It's trying to prevent, those who are not authorized to access the data to view it. So we see that tied, pretty closely to the regulations and things along those lines. The integrity is all about ensuring the data isn't manipulated and changed while it's, being held within an organization. That's important, especially in healthcare. Obviously it's important in the financial industry and other industries, but when we look at healthcare, the integrity of the data could have significant patient safety impact. All it would take, within different organizations or different EMRs is tweaking some of those numbers, the diagnosis, the value of drugs that are being distributed, and could cause real patient harm, patient safety issues. So the integrity within healthcare, to me, is really could be considered one of the most important things. But it's important to keep in mind that all 3 of these play together. And then the last one is the availability, and making sure that the data is available to those who need access to it, appropriate access to it, in a timely fashion. And we're seeing a lot of issues, in that availability space when it comes to ransomware, right? We're seeing organizations, hospitals, that the data is unavailable to them. They're not unable to really continue the traditional or their kind of traditional processes and forms of patient care and having to go to some form of contingency plan. So I would just say those are the three aspects of it. I'm definitely believe that there's not one that's more important than the other. They're all equally important and equally concerning, and we got to make sure that as you build a security program, all three are taken into account and you move it forward in that manner.
Appreciate the slide, and of course that CIA makes it very easy to remember. And
that's
very
how we title you. That's sounding
connected.
Cool.
Yeah, it's very very cool. And thank you. We're seeing some questions come in already, so I'll share those as we go along. Here's one. We're concerned about cybersecurity risks brought on by third-party vendors. What are the key risks that third parties represent with respect to delivering software as a service in particular, and what are some of the approaches to address them? Ooh,
great question.
You, John.
Yeah, that is a great question, and then we are seeing that. So I will say, when we look at the third-party risk, we have to be very careful not to separate that out from other types of risk, right? Risk is to the organization, sort of risk is risk when it comes to these decisions. So I'm going to bring up another slide because I am somewhat of a visual person, and I knew there'd be a risk question that comes up, and this is my favorite. So when we look at risk, we have to make sure that we're looking at the right thing and we're taking it in the right context. In order for risk to exist, three things have to come together. We have to be able to pull in, identify the threat itself, so some form of malware, phishing, denial of service, the threat, the attack, something along those lines. The other piece is, and I'm going to work from the bottom up, is the vulnerability. So we have to have something that is the threat's able to exploit. So like a legacy operating system, running Windows XP, a lack of patching. Patch management is very difficult. It's a struggle, and it's also one of the reasons why it's so valued by the hackers or the attackers are going to use that lack of patching or the issues that we have patching to exploit our network. Another example would be missing antivirus controls along those lines. And then the third piece to this is you have to have an asset. So we have to have laptop. When we look at terms of our organization kind of within our four walls, it's that traditional, the laptop server, a database. But at the same time, you could also add in any of the vendors. Any of your third parties, the vendors themselves could be considered an asset. The data that they're holding is your asset. And so when those three things come together, you have a vulnerability on an asset that a third party or a threat can exploit, that becomes your risk. So, kind of to get back and answer the question on, is there anything that is high profile that we need to look out for? I would just say, it's yes, there is. We have to make sure that we're assessing the vendors, making sure they have the appropriate controls in place. That we have to be involved in the vendor lifecycle management process, assessing those early on. We're at the table with the business unit to understand what we're trying to do, what we're trying to accomplish, and how do we move that forward. So, first, did that answer the question? I kind of went a little bit long-winded there, but did I get to the heart of that question?
And I can see, and I appreciate you having the visual, and there are new factors when you have a third party that's coming. Share some lessons learned in number one, vetting third party apps, and then on how to build a third party risk management program around these three aspects of risk management.
Absolutely. And so lessons learned, I've really skinned my knees in this area and do have a lot of lessons learned from that space. The first one is, and this is just making sure that we're not the department of no, right? We don't want to be seen as that group that's always going to say no when a business unit is wanting a vendor or looking at a third party, looking at an application. That's really not what our role is. So we need to, keep that in mind, that we're really looking to partner with that business unit to help them find the best solution for them, one that is meeting their needs, it's effective and efficient, but then it's secure as well. So kind of the process that I've put in, we have to start off with triaging, understanding what's the vendor going to be used for, what type of data are they holding, how are they going to transmit data. It's kind of some of those basic things that we have. Is it going to be revenue generating, things like that, just so we can prepare for next steps and understand the risk. Another piece to that is starting the questions, right? sending off a list of questions to the vendor if it's appropriate, and start to dig into what are their security controls, how are they going to secure our information, and then analyze those questions as they come back, look for gaps, and determine does that create risk for us, and are we seeing that we have risk that we have to address. Couple things that when you look at that lessons learned that I've seen, I mentioned being the Department of No. Another piece of that is we want to make sure that the business can use this information, right? It's the business decision to move forward. If we identify something that's significant, a high risk, high profile item that they need to take into account, we need to quantify that, give it to that business unit or the executive team as needed for them to make a well-informed decision. Maybe the risk that we find is outweighed by the benefit that comes from the solution, and so they can make that decision if they should move forward. Because that's just something to keep in mind, that it's really all about providing good information for those individuals to make the right decision.
Terrific. And as you were answering that question, John, I know a month or so ago you interviewed one of our HCG member organizations, Eric Decker and his team, on interoperability. And perhaps in the follow-up, we can provide a link to that for more information. I think that would be very valuable to hear what Independent Health up in Buffalo has been experiencing. As I think about this and look at those factors, a new element with respect to COVID-19 has been on the provider side with respect to telehealth. And what specific security considerations should providers, especially those in small practices, who are starting to do telemedicine and remote monitoring and all of those, what are some of the specific things they should look at that are important? And they don't have a big IT department to help them out either.
Right. And the first part of that is back to that evaluation. We need to assess the vendor and make sure that it is a compliant, solid, strong solution. That's not the end. That's never the end of it. The technology is just one component. But I would start there, understand that, and then also start to look at the processes. So as we start to bring in and stand up this kind of telehealth program, understand the processes that are going to be used around it. One thing we need to, early on, we need to make sure we have in place is that we are understanding how we're going to authenticate the user or the patient in this program. How we're going to identify and confirm that they are who they say they are. So we're providing the right information to them, the appropriate information to them, and treating them well. Another piece to that is we have to make sure that if the data is transmitted over the internet, which in the telehealth platform it's going to be, that we are transmitting that securely. So it is, if we're going to use it for a patient consult, with the patient at their house, that we're using strong encryption over the internet, and that's just going to scramble, kind of create almost, think of it as a pipe that's going from the provider space to the patient space, and it's securing and making sure no one can eavesdrop, look in on that data, and do something malicious with it. So that's definitely a key to work through. I do have kind of back to your third-party risk slide, because it kind of question, it does tie to that. I do have another slide that I want to bring up just as a visual of when I mentioned, that discover what's happening, analyze that data, treat, monitor. This is kind of an example. This is a visual representation of that. And the key piece to it is, you never just want to be happy and kind of look at only the technology, because really what makes up this IT space is the people, process, and technology. So when I say, you want to assess the technology, you want to assess the platform, absolutely you want to. But then you also want to dig into that process. And once it's been laid out and defined, start to kind of poke holes in it, but understand really what's happening, how the data is going to flow, where the data will be stored, accessed, or transmitted, and make sure that we have the appropriate controls in place there. Because as we know, we just mentioned a minute ago that the bad guys are opportunistic. As this starts to become a bigger space and we're using it more and more, and it's really becoming kind of the new routine, it's going to be another vector for attack.
And that another excellent slide. And John, if you're okay with this, at the end of the when we follow up, we'll share this slide so that you can each digest it a little bit more. So you said a whole bunch of things that I have questions about.
Sure.
In terms of that comment about this small physician practice that's now shifted to telemedicine, and assuring that you're talking with the right person. Um, uh, how do you do that? I mean, I've experienced myself, name,
Yep.
address. Are there any other things that can help uh, uh, a provider assess that I'm talking to the right person?
Yeah, and it really starts at, it's that very beginning of the process. So you want to make sure, and this is kind of just what we've done with the organizations I've been with, but then also as a patient, what we've done, what I've made sure is kind of in place with, with my providers is while I'm in the office, there is some type of kind of physical, acknowledgement of who I am, that I'm the right person, that the account that they're setting up for me is accurate, and that they will send information to me, and whether it's email or phone, to authenticate who I am. And then, we set up the account within the system. So kind of the registration that's really identifying me as me, the unique me within their platform. The other piece to it that I've really liked to see, it's newer. A lot of the platforms support it, but it's one thing that I really encourage most organizations to do is implement some form of multi-factor authentication with these, and that's making sure that if your account is compromised, along the way, that you can still identify you as you. So the username and password is that traditional. I know who I am through my username. I have my password, so that's I'm entering that in, but it's also something physical that I have. It would be that multi-factor, that another identifier, where they'll send you a text message to your phone, give you a call. Might be an app on your phone like Google Authenticator, Microsoft Authenticator, and that gives you that little secret code that you can put in at that point, which really just ensures that it is secure connection. You are who you are, and then you can feel confident and comfortable having that conversation with the physician and the patient at that point.
And and I've started experiencing a lot more of that, where an announcement is for me to get in. Do I want to receive a text or an email? I'm glad you mentioned multi-factor authentication. When you mentioned encryption, I'm thinking, especially with World War II and all the celebrations recently, kind of the code talkers, the Navajo language.
Yep, absolutely.
Code talkers out there that are mixing that pipeline up so that it can't be understood by anyone other than those having the access. And you mentioned the bad actors, and it is a constantly changing landscape. How does an organization remain committed and proactive to this program, this process you're talking about, while at the same time responding to the day-to-day tactical things? I mean, when COVID hit, people weren't going to the doctor's office. The doctor had to immediately start doing telephone consults. Well, just call me. I'm sure they weren't doing multi-factor authentication. They weren't encrypting. They were just picking up the phone. So how do you balance the two?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I will say from every person I speak to in security, that's the challenge, right? That's what we're always faced against. And I think there's two pieces to that. There's the one, we have to have a plan, right? So as we do our annual assessments or routine assessments, third-party assessments, we're gathering that information. We're using that to build our plan, implement the controls that we can really, see going forward. That could be a 1-year, 3-year, 5-year plan that you're exercising. But the other piece to it is, and it's kind of the other hat that you have to put on, is we have to be agile. We have to work at the speed of the business. The business is not going to say, well, you got a 5-year plan, so at the end of the 5th year, we're going to implement our, new strategy. It's never going to work that way. If the organization, healthcare payer, or the healthcare organization, provider payer, a financial organization, the business strategy is what's going to drive. That's what's going to move things forward. So we have to be able to react to that. So kind of my advice in that is, day-to-day operations, critical. It's always good that, we have that plan. We're looking at all of our tools, the firewall, spam filtering, URL filtering, and making sure that they are as effective and efficient as possible. Always tuning, always looking for, the new threats that are coming in, making sure that, we're ready for that. That's just that constant, churn day-to-day piece that goes on. But then, once again, being agile enough and ready to react to if the business needs to make a big change, like, I don't know, let's say in March they make the decision to send home 100% of the workforce, we have to be prepared for that. We have to be ready to jump on. We might not be able to secure it on day one, but we have to call out what are those risks, how to communicate those out to leadership, and then start to build that plan and get the right controls in place to ensure that it is secure from that point going forward.
Yeah, and I was remiss up front thanking all of the providers, the hospitals and the physicians on the front line dealing with this COVID pandemic. But as we describe this, there is that large percentage of those providers that are just in these small offices, and our heart goes out to HCG, Change Healthcare. We're all here to help. Right now isn't the time to promote business. It's really to solve problems. And if you're in the trenches, don't hesitate to reach out to us, and we'll see if we can get you some support. There is a question that just came in that's sort of an extension of what we've been talking about, John. In the past 6 to 8 weeks, we rushed to set up our staff to work remotely or at home. My boss has her concerns that home connections and office environments are not secure. What are the additional work from home security risks, and what are some of the programs and approaches we can use to minimize those risks with employees accessing our network and patient data from remote locations? Long question, but
that's a great question. Yeah, and what we're seeing, kind of some of the big things that we're seeing with that is, one, because it ended up, a lot of companies had plans, but obviously we didn't plan for this, this extent. As long as it took the scale of it, we weren't. I'd be surprised if anyone said they were 100% prepared for this particular incident or event that occurred. So what a lot of organizations did, they boxed up desktops. They gave, the users took their laptops home, but not all organizations were in a position to where, we could patch and update systems on the fly. So what we're seeing is systems are getting infected, right? They're behind in their patching. Their antivirus isn't getting the latest updates. The policies aren't getting pushed appropriately because we're connecting from a different method, right? It's not all 24/7, always on, sitting in the cubicle anymore. They're scattered throughout the country. So, I'd say the key thing there is we want to make sure, in order to prevent infections and malware from getting on those machines and then spread through the network, that we are finding ways to, maybe it's creatively, we're putting or allowing machines to patch directly from the internet, or we're putting some kind of intermediate server out on the internet to update those machines, looking at different types of software that can do that kind of from the cloud. So they're good things to make sure, or controls that are in place to work. One other piece, kind of back to that creativity, right? Because I think we can't be looking for that, the silver bullet that's going to solve all of our problems, just looking for the new technology. But traditional way that we do it is, make sure machines are connecting to the VPN, and we can push the patches down to them or updates to those endpoints through the VPN. We might have to schedule, but certain groups can get their updates at this time if bandwidth is a problem. That does occur for the smaller organizations, but we just need to make sure we have a plan and we're marching to that to minimize that risk. Another area that we've noticed, because traditionally we would encrypt the laptops because we're used to those being mobile, but we didn't do so much with the desktops, the physical, the bigger boxes that people took out. So we need to make sure that those are encrypted. If they're going to be out of that the four walls of the organization, that we do have encryption on them, just in case, if they're lost or they're stolen. It's going to be difficult to lose a desktop, but you'd be surprised. Things can happen. Unfortunately, houses could be broken into, and somebody could take that desktop and run out with it. Not necessarily to steal the data, but just to maybe pawn it or just use it for their personal use. Right, it's a computer. And unfortunately, if there's patient data on there, even if it's not used for selling the data or anything like that, because it's been compromised at that point, we have to assume that that would be a breach. And so you want to make sure you have encryption. You have the same controls that you have in the four walls as you do outside. So kind of back to that, just be creative, see what we can do, how are we going to update those, and make sure that we are preventing some of those risks.
Terrific. Another question's just come in, kind of back to the previous conversations. How can I ensure our employees, contractors, partners are aware of how to report security risks or threats through multiple channels of communication? Because you got email, you got
Sure.
phones, you got lots of communications out there. It doesn't seem that just email cuts it.
No, yeah, that's a great question, especially now that we're all remote, right? I mean, everyone's kind of
Yeah.
scattered. So yeah, email doesn't cut it. It's just not fast enough in some cases. So I would, any way that you can sort of, educate the users, the employees, to notify the IT security department of an incident, big or small, right? That's not the end user's responsibility to worry about if it's a minor issue versus a large one. But so what we traditionally do, and kind of what we help some of our clients with, is building into their incident management program or incident response program different ways that they can communicate potential issues. So we want to make sure that the end users know that they can dial in, call the help desk or service desk to report a potential issue. Email is a great way. Hopefully, and some organizations will have some type of chat functionality with their help desk tool. That's another great one. Or now that we have a lot of different collaboration tools like instant messaging and obviously texting is another good one. They can send in the information that way and really start the process of an investigation if they feel that there's something wrong. So I would say use any form of communication possible. Educate the users that they can. The one isn't better, but they can report these issues any way possible. Because the key is we want to start that investigation immediately, right? We don't want to be surprised. We don't want to, just a user has a pop-up and it doesn't look good, but I'm just going to let it, kick off the side because reporting this stuff is overly difficult, or I don't know who to call. We want them to report that immediately so we can start looking at it and understand, is it an issue? Is it, maybe just a adware popped up and it's really minor, or, is their machine infected, and that's going to cause some big issues down the road.
Terrific.
So.
Terrific. We aren't the USS Theodore Roosevelt where the commander is going to be discharged because of raising an alert. Multiple ways. Get the information out there quickly, because the sooner you shut it down, the less damage that might be there. As you're talking, right, John, I'm sensing, and I felt it, this tug of war over data access, especially at the consumer level, with the providers needing to do telehealth consulting and like that, versus the privacy and security issue. And it seems that the days of only focusing on that hard outer shell seem to be over, whereas at the same time, there is a shift to really be more around making sure the data doesn't get out of the organization. What can be done to balance that and to mitigate that risk?
Yeah, you nailed it. The days of the what we used to call the M&M security, right? You got that hard outer shell, and the nice soft gooey inner shell or inner piece is gone, right? We now have to secure the data, whether it's in our network, whether it's at home. All of us, the majority of us are working from home right now, or have been, or within a third-party organization. The data has to be secured the same way, using the same controls, or at least the best controls possible to protect it. So, to that point, I think it's very important to make sure that we're doing those assessments. We're digging into understanding how data will flow. Data flow diagrams are beautiful in this case, and making sure that we're authenticating users. Used to be traditionally, before you come into the building, you're authenticated with either your badge or the VPN connection from a digital perspective. But once again, those days are gone. So we have to be able to authenticate the individual, which is going to be, I think multi-factor authentication has to be built into that. And we have to make sure that, we're going through that process. If data is going to live in a data center, making sure you got strong physical controls around it, and then, encryption if it's out in the field. All laptops should be encrypted for organizations. It's a safety precaution. You hear a lot of times it slows down the system. It could, but we need to make sure we have that kind of control in place. But I think most important is, rather than trying to secure things on the back end, right? Rather than always working from behind, if security can be up front with, the business strategy, understand what's the direction, where are we going to go? Part of the IT strategy, we know the business is saying that, they want to go use this kind of new type of, I don't say technology, but new business venture. IT believes that the best strategy for that is to move something to the cloud or use a third-party app for that. We want the IT or the security team to be right there with that decision, not necessarily to say no, we shouldn't do that, because once again that's really not our place, but to say completely understand if that's the direction we want to go. We need to make sure we have X, Y, Z in place, and it's built into that solution just to minimize any disruption and make sure it's funded as part of that project, so there are no surprises down the road.
Terrific. And right along this theme, another question that's come in, sharing via video, remote access, remote monitoring has exploded at our firm. We hear a lot about privacy and security issues with platforms like Zoom. Are there industry benchmarks? How much should we be investing there? What are the safeguards that we need to put in place with respect to video and remote monitoring?
Yeah, that's a great question. As far as industry benchmarks go, I'm not aware of any that are specific to per employee or per user, but I think Forrester and Gartner both kind of come out and they're around saying, or they say about 3 to 5% of IT budget should be, or security budgets, 3 to 5% of security budget should be part of IT budgets, something along those lines. And that's been, I think, pretty fair. It's different organizations I've been with, it's about what's being spent. So if you're in there, that's a good piece. I think the other part of it is, when we're looking at, especially the video conferencing, I wouldn't limit yourself to just saying a particular platform is secure or insecure because it was on the news. That's not the case. I think a lot of times what you have to do is evaluate what platform is right for you, which one meets your requirements or controls. A lot of the platforms that exist out there are free, right? I think there's lots of free versions of different tools, and they are fantastic unless you're using them to transmit and hold conversations that are going to be should be deemed confidential. Perfect example is we talked about telehealth. A lot of people use I don't want to name drop any solutions, but Zoom, GoToMeeting, different things like that to conduct those, because there's a free version on some of those, and that's great. But once you start getting that confidential information, you want to make sure you have the controls like authentication, encryption, things like that. And a lot of times what happens is, in order to get that level of service, it has to be a paid for solution. So you need to factor that in, as just making sure that whatever tool we're using, we're doing a good evaluation of it. We know what our requirements are, both from the IT and security side, and we're implementing that accordingly. And
so what you're saying is testing. You get what you pay for. If I want to have FaceTime or a Zoom with my grandkids in Texas, fine. If somebody's watching, that's okay. Although, the interruptions, some of the pornography and like that was initially out there, and I understand Zoom has locked that down. So, like you say, you get what you pay for. Free is good, convenient, but not necessarily going to meet the HIPAA and high-tech requirements. So standards we're going to be held to. Another question.
Absolutely.
That's come in, and this is a very current one. It was announced a year ago. I remember sitting at HIMSS and hearing CMS make the announcements, but they've come out with new interoperability rules that require health plans to provide consumers access to the data through third-party applications using open APIs. What security considerations do health plans like ours need to think about? Good question.
Good, very good one, and timely, right? I mean, it's coming quick. I think we're supposed to start really working with that. I remember it's January 1st of 2021, so things are coming fast. We need to be prepared for it. From a security side, you've kind of beating the drum here. The vetting or authenticating users is critical, right? We want to make sure that we're able to, if a user or a patient is asking for their data, which they completely have the right to. Us as the provider or the payer, it's not our data to own. We don't own it. We're a custodian of it. We're holding that data for the patient. So if they want it, take it someplace else, completely they're right. But we do need to make sure that before they make that request, that we know who they are. I think another good thing that organizations should do is vet the third-party applications, just because There's an app out there in the App Store. Doesn't mean that it is secure. So we need to help as we kind of create these portals and create the plugins for where the data is going to go and how it's going to move, that we're vetting some of those third parties and making sure that it is secure. Maybe not, to the nth degree, but it's, we have the basic controls in place that we're not being negligent at that point. Back onto the authenticating the user, I think it's critical that, and I've already said it a few times, with that multi-factor authentication, the days of just a strong password are unfortunately, they're gone. With all the phishing that's going on and the amount of passwords that are being compromised, that happens quick. And we might not, just from an end user standpoint, I think I get alerted every few days or every few months of, one of my accounts has been, my email account from my personal email account's been compromised. I need to change the password. I would really be, terrified if I didn't have multi-factor authentication on those, just as another layer of that security. I think that with these apps and the way the data is going to be transmitted, we need to make sure that we do have some additional forms of authentication other than just a password. And the other piece is we have to be able to track the consumer consent. We have to be able to know if as a user or as a patient, I'm requesting my data, I want to take it someplace else. The payer needs to be able to identify or track that they have agreed to take their data, that they understand the risks. Should there be data moving it to some unauthorized third party, that it's no longer our responsibility to secure it, it's theirs. It moves into their control at that point. So making sure that we have that clean audit trail, that they've agreed to this, they're consenting to moving the data, and we can store that, because it's going to be needed for two different things. I see. One, we're going to have audits that come up, and we want to be able to show we have the evidence that we've tracked this. But the second is, as this goes out there and it becomes, especially in that new, kind of, while it's still, there's going to be a breach, and we want to be able to say, as a healthcare organization, I protected the data the best that I could. We made sure that the consumer, the end user, knew the risk of taking it and using it, moving it over here. But they also agreed to this this consent, that they're willing to take that risk and move it. I think the benefit of this is we're going to have healthcare is going to be greatly increased. I, as a consumer, are going to be able to make some great good decisions using my data. So I think it's going to help healthcare. It's going to be great for healthcare in that sense, but we want to make sure it's secure. So we don't want to be an obstacle, but we want to make sure that we're moving fast enough to help the patient get what they need, but then doing the right things, putting the right controls in place, that it's we're not making mistakes.
Terrific. And
unfortunately, you can click. So you can click these things very quick, and if we're not careful, bad things could happen easily.
Right. I'm glad you mentioned consumer consent, John. And, sometimes you have to be careful what you ask for, because you might get it. We've been trying to engage the consumer in their health. Clearly, with COVID-19, consumers all of us are very engaged with our health, with everything that's been going on. But one of the aspects, and we probably don't have time to address that today, that keeps going through my mind is the consumer may want to provide this piece of data to this person or this provider in a different part of their medical record to another provider. Any advice for organizations as they start thinking about this consumer access and consumer consent down at the almost data element level?
Yeah. I mean, my advice at this point is making sure that as we do it, we're building solutions that are scalable. We're able to your point, get to that level, because it's going to be needed. If it's not needed, day one, down the road, we're going to see, patients make that request, because once again, it is their data, and there's going to be a lot of decisions made off of it. And sharing the data with a lot of different third parties is for good reasons, right? I mean, different specialists are going to want that data, and I think we're getting away from the days of faxing and emailing some of this stuff over.
Hopefully.
These APIs will be, yeah, exactly. These APIs are going to be critical. So I think it's good to, we need to make sure we plan them accordingly. We lay out, what's the requirement? How do we want to make this move? Start as early as possible. I think waiting until the last minute is going to be troublesome. We're going to see a lot of issues if organizations do wait to the last minute. So planning accordingly, good, architecture for how this is going to work, and from the security side, assessing that along the way. And I think that's where some of these industry experts come in, like a Change Healthcare, that we can definitely help organizations with that.
Terrific. And there's questions still coming in. Just for the listeners, we don't want to run this right up to the hour, so we'll wrap up here in just a bit. But we will respond to all of the questions that have come in. A couple of three wrap up comments or questions that I want to toss out there. Do you have any one inside tip as to what's new that's most important to address right now and through the rest of the year? Is there a silver bullet or something everybody should be focused on?
Yeah. As far as the silver bullet goes, well, we kind of step back. I think one area we mentioned early on that we're seeing, this large increase in phishing attacks. So we know we need to be, vigilant of those and making sure we are, tuning our systems to prevent phishing or using that multi-factor authentication in case credentials are compromised, patching systems to limit, any type of malware that could come in from either clicking on a phishing link or going past and visiting a malicious website or a compromised website. So those are kind of the, some of the key items. But really, I think it boils down to, one, we have to have good cyber hygiene. Right? We should be doing these things every day. And just because there's more things in the news and there's more attacks, these are items that we should constantly be doing, constantly patching. We need to have a good cycle when it comes to patching. And if there's a new, what they call the 0-day threat or a brand new threat that comes out of vulnerability, we need to patch for that as soon as possible. We need to have good antivirus that I mentioned, that URL filtering. So just in case, a malicious link does come in through email and a user clicks on it, if we're blocking some of those malicious websites, then we'll prevent that from occurring. So definitely we need to have these layers of security in place. But one other thing that I kind of mentioned, and because you asked for that silver bullet, and there is, I'll just say it sort of maybe sarcastically, there's one silver bullet, right? And that's, I'm going to bring up a screen real quick on here. So I don't know if you can read this. This is a bit of an eye chart, but this is the magic bullet. Right, doing all of these things
that looks like
will
a shotgun.
Definitely help us. Yeah, there you go. It's a scattered approach. This is all the things that when we look at security, cybersecurity, information security, all of the things that we really need to be looking at throughout our program. Kind of once again, depending on your organization, one might be definitely drastically more important than the other. But these are all of those items we need to make sure we're addressing. We're doing our due diligence in each of these areas. So just to call out a couple of things. This is that security operations where we're scanning systems, we're looking for vulnerabilities, doing that patching, responding to those incidents or alerts that come in from our end users if they see something bad happening. So I'd say this definitely needs to be an area or the areas that we focus on, and just make sure that we have somebody accountable in each of these spots. Doesn't have to be security. Many organizations I've been with or worked with, all of these functions are spread out through different areas. Like human resources will have a good role in it. The traditional IT group will be doing a lot of that work. It could be the patching or deploying antivirus solutions or creating secure configurations for endpoints. So there's a lot of different ways we can slice it up, but it's just important that we're addressing all of them along the way as part of our program.
So this is definitely a slide in follow-up, John, that each of us on the call will want to digest. You've color-coded it into group areas. There's more detail than we could cover today, but that's a terrific resource for each of us that are concerned about cybersecurity, and especially in this COVID environment, areas to focus on, or at least questions to ask ourselves as to how we are. Another sort of closing question: how does an organization effectively manage this information security program in the communications to the executive team, the C-suite, and the board? Any tidbits there of advice for our group?
Yes, I'm gonna go back just to this slide right here, and I would say this is critical. So when it comes to communicating what is, the security issues, I think there's two forms of communication, or kind of two deliverables, that we need to keep in mind. There's that technical operational piece, which is, think of things like how many viruses have we seen this month, or how many messages have been blocked by the spam filter. Those are that's technical stuff that we within IT, the security teams, we care about and we want to look at. So I think what I would say is, you have that piece. The other piece is, what is our risk? And I think the risk aspect is what needs to be really communicated through leaders, the executive team, the board of directors. They need to know, what are the key risks, what's our strategy. And so kind of this process that I mentioned here, we have the discovery. This is where we're, once again, identifying the threats, the assets that we have, different controls that we have in place, or vulnerabilities. And then also, what's the potential impact if something bad should happen? Then we analyze that, and I would say it's critical that organizations, as you look at these issues, and you start to analyze risk, that we quantify it. And that's really putting, a number to it, and it could be anything from the financial impact. So we're actually putting a dollar amount around a particular risk. We're looking at from a regulatory impact. So, is there 500 records, 1,000 records, 2,000 records, 1,000,000 records that could be impacted with this particular risk? And then for those of us in healthcare, pretty much all of us in this call, we're looking at from a patient safety impact. What's the potential patient safety impact if something should occur, if a smart pump is compromised, something along those lines. So those are things to keep in mind. And then what I like to do is kind of create those scenarios. So we know what our risk is. We created a scenario of lost laptop, a phishing attempt is successful, and somebody's credentials are provided. Think of it of, is it the CFO? Is it the CEO? Is it a domain administrator? Can I put them in those terms? And then take that scenario with that potential, quantified impact, and use that as a presentation to the executive team and the board. So they're getting the context, they're understanding how this is impacting the business, and they're seeing what's the real value. It's a lot of times, I think, what we get caught up in within security is, we present things as high, medium, and low. So, the risk of this particular vulnerability is high, and so we kind of, shoot that out to everybody. Yeah, but it's just not really, it's lost, right? Because it's either too technical or it just doesn't have the right context. So I would say quantify your risk, communicate that, tie that into kind of your justification for budget, because that will help make that understanding. And definitely speak in terms that the business understands. If you're speaking to the CFO, you want to speak in financial terms. If you're speaking to could be the chief medical officer, you want to speak in that patient safety terms, because that's really what we want to do. We've been given a seat at the table. We want to make sure we use it appropriately.
Fantastic. So, bottom line, summarizing what we've talked about, healthcare is under attack from cybersecurity. Is there a fail-safe technical solution?
No, there's not one. Back to that chart that I had just a second ago. We have a lot of different steps that we can go through and that we need to go through. So I think we need to make sure that we are taking all of this into consideration. We're looking at things in layers. We want to make sure we have layers of security in place. I kind of mentioned, we've mentioned the phishing a few times on the call. If you think of how that works and how a phishing email could come in, it's that email in. So an opportunity is we block emails from malicious third parties. So that could be one stopgap. We use that URL filtering to make sure that if a link within that email is compromised, that it's blocked. Most importantly, we're educating all of the users that what to look for when it comes to phishing, what they need to be just looking out for, and looking for that malicious email, things that just don't look right, and reacting accordingly. And then also to the previous question, if we click a link and go to a bad spot and we provide our credentials and realize, oh, shouldn't have done that, where do I call? Who do I get a hold of to let them know that something bad has happened? And so I think unfortunately, there's not that one little magic bullet that we need to do. We need to take it all into consideration, but then we also need to make sure that we're doing it in layers. We have the right approach, and we're focusing on what are those high-risk items for us.
Terrific, John. This discussion this fireside chat could go on and on and on.
Do it all day.
And we
Yep.
really appreciate the opportunity to have you with us today to discuss the challenges and especially around information sharing, interoperability, data access, and the cybersecurity components of that in this, especially right now, the issues that we're facing with COVID-19. There's a lot that payers and providers clearly can do to collaborate more and work more together to make data interoperability and accessibility to providers and consumers and other stakeholders, while at the same time improving that security. We do hope, and we're going to wrap things up, that each of you have gained some insights on the actions that you can take around cybersecurity and privacy and security. Please be sure to look for the recap of today's webinar, and we will include all of those additional questions that we've seen coming. John, I think we have a closing slide that has some contact information on it, but thank you, John, for bringing your expertise and the services of Change Healthcare and your experience with those, bringing those to this important discussion. In closing, you have here an invite to join us in ongoing discussions throughout the year via LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, our biweekly newsletter or monthly newsletter as time permits. And finally, a special thanks to Change Healthcare for sponsoring HCG over many years, and to all of you for participating with us today in this webinar. Stay safe, be well, and have a great day. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Have a good one.
Appreciate it, John.